Welcome. This is Soren with Wisdom 2.0. Our next interview is with renowned basketball coach Phil Jackson. Phil is in conversation with George Mumford, the author of The Mindful Athlete, and who Phil hired to teach the Lakers and the Bulls mindfulness and meditation during their championship years. Also joining them is mindfulness teacher Jon Kabat-Zinn. Enjoy. So thank you all for coming and being a part of this conversation. It's a real honor to have each of you with us. And I thought, Phil, there's a story that hasn't really been told, or at least I haven't heard it, which was, how this vision of integrating mindfulness in sports, and particularly in basketball, kind of first came to you. And would love to hear, just to kind of start off, how that initial vision came. Or that was something you'd always dreamed about as a player doing, and then, or there was some moment you had where you realized, wow, the traditional way of coaching, we need more tools in our toolbox, and there's this whole other mental side that I want to bring in. But could you kind of tell us a little bit about how that kind of first emerged in your world?
I'd love to, yes. It's interesting that, I'm a son of ministers. My mom and dad were both ministers, and grew up with a spiritual background where a lot of the outside world was tried to be eliminated or exposed at a very limited basis. We had a Reader's Digest, a World Encyclopedia. We got the local newspaper, but no TV, and pretty much little emphasis on media and media content. We listened to Paul Harvey at lunch. That was kind of one of the things that we did do. But as I grew up and joined sports, I realized there's such a spiritual aspect to being part of a team, being part of a group, and having come out of a very deeply religious group that involves spiritual feelings and spiritual emotions. I ended up going to graduate school in between my MBA careers, the first 2 or 3 years, in psychology. I had got a degree in psychology, philosophy, and religion, a composite degree when I was in college. And I went on to graduate school in between. At that period of time, NBA basketball players were making a modest salary, but it was good. I mean, I came out in late 60s, I was making $12,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 a year in the 60s, and it's nothing compared to what's being made now by athletes. So we were preparing for an afterlife outside of basketball, and my preparation was perhaps to be a teacher or to be involved in therapy. I got into a lot of group therapy at that time. Ellis was a real big name at that time, Maslow, etc. And there's a big deal about group dynamics and how people feel accomplished in a group. And so it continued on. A little bit was written in a book I wrote with Charlie Rosen called Maverick in the late 70s. But then as I moved into coaching and experienced that at a coaching level, I began to search for something that would be more meaningful as a coach. And initially, as I moved into the head coaching position with the Chicago Bulls, I tried to bring a little bit of silence and meditation to the group. And in '92, after winning a championship, I wanted to do something different to start the next season. And I was at Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. I'd been there for a number of years. And Jon Kabat-Zinn introduced George Mumford as a possible person that would come, former basketball player from the University of Massachusetts, worked in the penal system in Massachusetts with mindfulness, and thought that it might be a real good opportunity to coordinate that together. And I realized that perhaps I wasn't the right person to teach mindfulness to these players. So anyway, we started out in that year. Of course, that's the year Michael Jordan retired from basketball in September, right before training camp. And so we were going through a whole new process of integrating the team. We had 11 of our 12 championship players still back with the team. So they were pretty cooperative. And I'd introduced them to some tribalism through my relationship with the Pine Ridge Indians in Lakota world out in South Dakota. So there's a little tribalism that was involved with the Bulls, and there was a certain sense of that. going on at a deeper level. And we talked about a vision quest when we'd gone through a series with the Detroit Pistons back in the early 90s. And we completed a very successful run with 3 championships. But now we're stepping into some unknown territory. And I started having a practice session that was a continuous day. And I thought that perhaps we could do this preseason training, which required 2-a-day practices, usually in the morning and in the evening, and to combine them and just have a practice in the morning, a 2-hour break, and a practice in the afternoon. And during that 2-hour break, they had a lunch, a little rest session, and then we came up and we did these type of issue trainings. Some of it was cooperative and some of it was meditation. And that's when George got introduced into the basketball world with the Chicago Bulls.
Beautiful, thank you. And so, Jon Kabat-Zinn, do you remember meeting Phil and making that connection?
Yeah, it actually, came about indirectly, but nevertheless, the contact was made, and I was just delighted to hear about it because, George and I go way back, and both members of the Cambridge Insight Meditation Society. And at the time, George was working for me at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society, launching an inner city clinic that we were offering free to people who would not come to the flagship UMass Medical Center. So we held it in a community hospital in the inner city and offered programs in English and as well as Spanish. And George was one of the founders of that program and the co-director of that program for a number of years. And it was, we just hit it off working together in that kind of a way. It was a real adventure. And then also some people showed up at a certain point. The commissioner of criminal justice of the state of Massachusetts and was interested, after going through the 8-week MBSR program, in bringing it into the prisons. And so we collaborated with them for a number of years doing that, and George headed up that program as well. So we began to feel, and this is a very long time ago when meditation is not as mainstream as it is now, and some people would look at it as kind of slightly beyond, if not seriously beyond, the lunatic fringe. We really felt that we were at the cutting edge of something that was profoundly missing in the society. And if it was profoundly missing in the early and mid 1990s, now it's, even more essential, I would say, globally and certainly in this country, because of everything that's going on in our world and in our society. So there's something about the fact that you've done this work in the NBA with 11 rings to your credit and a kind of a super arc of successes in a very, very challenging domain, that's inspirational to millions and millions of people. And so the story behind the success, especially the kind of mind-body connection, both in the individual and then in a team of individuals, 5 players on the floor at the same time. What is going on? What are the levels of connectivity? What are the kind of assumptions? How do you function together in such a way that the whole may be more effective than the sum of the parts? I think this is the part of the story that you were alluding to earlier, Soren, about the possibility of really learning from your experience, Phil, about how to bring this out in people in general, not so much for the game of basketball, but even more for the game of life, not that they're necessarily separate. And I myself am really interested in hearing, because I know that you, George, and you, Phil, encouraged them and provided the foundation and taught them all these meditative practices. But I'm also interested in what you learned from the individual players about how to relate to who they were in a way that invited them to explore elements of themselves that they may not have realized were there and draw on them in such a way that enhanced not only their own performance, but the interconnectivity of the team.
That's a really good point. There's ability by George to tap into what we were teaching our players. We had a system of basketball that's called the sideline triangle, or it's had a number of names, triple post offense. There are a number of names that went along with it. But inside of that was a collective mindset that we called using the offense to read the defense, and then at the moment of truth to make the appropriate action. And George tapped into that moment of truth as part of that experience that we have in meditation, which is to be available at the moment of truth.
Yeah.
And that's being here now, and which is such an important point. So there's a number of things that were going on with our players at this time. Various players could get attached to their feelings, could get attached to a bad call, could get attached to some fan that was in the stand that was harassing them, to get attached to their family where someone was interfering with their family's presence while they were playing basketball that could distract them. So those distractions could multiply during a course of a game. And so, we talked about this moment of truth and how to get to this moment of truth and stay in the flow. And that's kind of what we learned from these players was, how do we stay there and release that moment that was distractful and get back into the present? And so finding these players' ability to do that, I think had a lot to do with the fact that George tried a number of methods. We tried, little things like a rubber band on the wrist, which is, an ADHD type of thing, snap that rubber band, take a breath. Then we started to get into this idea, one breath, one mind, which became the next ability is, as a group, we're going to sit and we're going to extend this period of thought, dropping thought, and just following our breath till we feel like we're one breath, one mind as a group. And then when we get on the basketball court, we're going to try and extend that until we eventually became a team that was playing for themselves, for their own entertainment, for their own hierarchy of needs or approval. It wasn't about the opponent anymore. It was about how to do this the right way, and we called it, appeasing the basketball gods, playing the game the way it should be played.
That's beautiful. George, do you want to share what it was like for you to enter a new world, and what did you tell the players you were?
Yes. So it's interesting because I think a couple of things that set the tone. Number one was their trust in Phil, and the fact that they knew he would not bring anything into the system that would be harmful. So that's number one, because so they knew that. The number two, because I roomed with Dr. J in college, I had street cred. And because I grew up in the inner city and I had similar experiences as a lot of the players on the team had, there was this, there's just a connection because, but then again, that's what this practice has helped me to do, is meet people where they are and meet them and connect with them and find something that they're interested in. So when I talk to them about being a warrior, martial arts, and when I talk to them about being in the zone or being in flow, then that kind of got their attention. But even before that, the thing that happened was Phil and I had a conversation. I think it might have been on your way. You might have even been at Omega or on your way to your summer place. And we had a conversation and say, okay, I would come in at training camp, and that was 1993. And in the interim, Michael Jordan's father got murdered and Michael retired. And so when I got there, it wasn't that we were dealing with, and the thing that excited me about the opportunity were two things. Number one, Phil looked at the whole person. So we were we were aligned in terms of how we see people. And he was asking me to come in not to help win the championship, but to help them deal with the stress of success. People need to understand that was the context. And then so going in there and then not having Michael, we were in full-blown crisis by the time I got there. And then so it wasn't just helping them to do this, but also creating a vision of possibility where they would be willing to say, okay, so yes, we talk about crisis having two meanings, one being danger, the other one being opportunity. And so, yeah, there's danger, but there's an opportunity for us to really step into that space and find ourselves stepping that space and make it happen. And so when I went there, and for me personally, I'm going in and I'm saying, okay, I'm gonna go in and work with these guys. They already won 3 championships. What do I have to say to them? How are they gonna listen to me? And that's just my person, me thinking as a person. But then once I got to the point where it's like, listen, this is not different. When I lived in the meditation center, I used to go out and work with people all over the place. So I worked in prisons, I worked in inner city clinics, I worked with kids, Yale jail. So I was programmed to do that. So I just went in and I really just let the mindfulness and the wisdom to dictate what I was going to do. And this is a lot of Phil's process, as we'll be going along and we talk about it, but then we're in the moment. It's just like the game. The moment of truth could be at a practice or something happens and then we got to address it, or we see an opportunity to go in and do something and then we do it. So to me, it's like, I think about it now and I think about, man, you were very brave going into this situation. You had no idea what was going to happen. But I was so touched by the practice of my own practice and me overcoming substance abuse. And I'll just put it out there. Today's my 36th anniversary of being clean and sober. Been 36 years. And so back in 93, that was, I had been clean for about 9 years. So if I could deal with that, I could deal with anything. So it was really just going in and being a message, meeting them where they were, and then offering teachings in an accessible, practical way. But as Phil talked about, when we could talk about it in a way where we don't have a gaining idea, but there's a benefit from it. But that's really important. It's like, just like getting in the flow. If you want to get in flow of the zone, the best way to get in there is not to try to get in there. And so it's a paradox. It's like, we want you to be present and just be in a moment in and of itself without trying to do anything, but allowing things to happen. And you're talking about people who are in a highly pressured environment. And then when you win 3 championships in a row, you got to think about the fact that they play probably a whole season more than most people. When you think about each, they're playing the June every year. And so that's another 27 games. So 27, let's just say that's like 81 games. That's almost a whole season. And so you have that on top of the pressure. So coming from the stress reduction and relaxation program, which is what we called it in those days before it became the Center for Mindfulness, it was really more about how to help them use their inner resources and to develop higher levels of wellness. And we used to use the wellness model, John, of course, you're familiar with that. So I continued to do that through awareness, education and growth. How do we get them to get better each day and get them in the moment and managing what we could manage and allowing things to happen. So as Phil said, talked about the moment of truth, and it could be on a basketball court. When you cross half court, you have to make a decision, because that 10-second line becomes another player. And so the play in the system he played in, you have to be in the moment, and you have to see things and react in real time, where you don't have time to think. You have to just take what's given. And so the practice teaching them how to be mindful, how to be present, was very accessible in the sense that they could actually see some of the benefits right away, simply because they have to have this ability to be in a moment, be able to see things. We're in this crisis. How are we going to relate to it in a way that empowers us and it gives us more energy and helps us go to the next level. And so that's how I remember it. So it was really more about, Phil and I being, aligned in our values and how he saw the players. And that was so important to me. I knew that on some level, but it was on a deep level to realize that, he was seeing a whole person. He wasn't seeing a basketball player. He was interested in who they were as people and wanted them to have a life. So to me, I kind of see like, I could see where they were kind of like his congregation, if you will, or his sheep. Like I was thinking about this this morning when I was walking on the beach, is that, I don't want to call them sheep, but if you're like David and you're tending sheep, you want to account for every one of those sheep. Every one of those sheep have equal value. It's not like, okay, this is the sheep that can reproduce, or this, whatever it is, or this is the one that's the pride. No, I have to attend to my whole flock. And that was the energy unspoken that I felt from Phil, and I was right home. I was at home. So it was easy. And so it was like, okay, how do we do this? And I feel like it's more like being like water. And like, if you look at the Indiana Jones series, when they ask Indiana Jones, hey, Indy, what are we going to do next? And he says, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. So it's like, the game of basketball on the fly, you have to have a process or structure where you can decide to read and react or respond in real time without even really knowing. And you don't really want a repetition. You have to meet it as if it's new and fresh every time. So I feel like the whole Zen concept of just being a martial artist, and just there's no sword, there's no enemy. It's just being in the moment and making choices in that space between stimulus and response. So just teaching them on many levels, some level intellectually, but through osmosis, or on some energetic level, them getting that this is going to be helpful and this is helping them to find themselves. I don't know if that makes
Soren,
sense.
I have a story I'll relate to on that level. When I went to LA, I took a team that was talented, a very talented team, and helped them try and get to where they wanted to get to in the championship level. And we had a game in that first year where at the end of a period, there was a certain sequence that I asked. It was a halftime. There was 3 seconds left on the clock. And one of my players, Robert Ory, was a designated guy to inbound the ball. It was a full court or 3/4 court play. We call it a home run. And I called for it, and Robert didn't accomplish it. He made a decision to go somewhere else. Well, we got in the locker room at halftime. I asked Robert, what was the deal, Robert? Why didn't you fulfill what I asked you to fulfill? And he said, I didn't hear your voice. So Robert's the son of a minister, and so I used a scriptural verse. I said, well, if you remember your scriptures, Robert, the sheep knows the master's voice. And I let it stand for a second. And I said, well, I don't want to load that master too heavily. But then, of course, they had a great deal of fun with it, and they called me master for the next month. So I was like locked into that. But that's part of it, for players to understand that there is one voice that you want to hear, and that's a voice. But that's what that team had to learn. That Laker team had to learn about how to deal with the voice. And it was an inner voice that they had to find. It wasn't an outer voice. But yes, we had many issues as we went along. Players that had attention deficit issues, players that had stress issues. George could make a tape for them to maybe reduce that amount of stress, because it's a very stressful business, obviously. And so there are multifaceted things that were going on at the same time with the players. They learned how to sit in silence. Usually, George would start off with a, where's our point of reference today? We have a center point here. What we call that, George? The continuum. The point is, are we on the plus side or are we on the negative side as a group?
Mm-hmm.
And we'd start out with things that would bring them in as tending to the group's spiritual function or their spiritual needs. And players would, were free to talk about the issues that were problematic for their group. And then, as we moved through a small intro section, George would bring them into a talking meditation and walk them into, through their body and into things. So it was started out relatively novice, and every year we had to go through new members. And so we would start out maybe in October after training camp, and we brought the team back down from 20 down to 12 or 13 members, and start bringing the orientation back, and then start prolonging the meditation segments from 5 to 10 minutes. And by the time the end of the season was on, they could sit. And these are men of action, obviously, but they could sit and be still and quiet for 10 to 15 minutes when they were finding the center. And I think that worked really well. We did it a lot of times before video sessions, which were always so personal, and they're so, to watch yourself make mistakes or have an error on the floor and have to deal with that humiliation or whatever group dynamic is going on. We could try and dispel that this isn't about negativity. This is about, watching what we can do to be better, to try and even the balance out of that emotional level. So there are formats that we'd use. A lot of times prior to a game or to a shoot around, we would have, a session where we would sit with players to bring about a level of acceptance or readiness of accepting a philosophy or a strategy that we were trying to promote. There's one instance when we were in a 7th game of a series on the road in Los Angeles in a Sacramento series that was extremely heated. Sacramento had a building that seated 18,000 people. There was like an old box. It was just a box of commercial box they had made into an 18,000 seat arena. So even in the locker room, you couldn't hear yourself because the seats or stands were directly above your head in their locker room. And so we met at a hotel prior to the game for a pregame dinner. And George attended our staff meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning. We were going to meet maybe at 9:30 with the players. And at 10 o'clock, they were going to go through a video session. And by the time we got downstairs to meet with the players at 9:30, they were all in their chairs, ready to go. Their focus was so high that day that it was really an outstanding performance by a team that was in a very stressful situation. And we've always kind of held that up as the readiness of players to use access to their greater self and their greater ability to focus.
Great. Jon, feel free to jump in anytime, Jon Kabat-Zinn, if you have reflections or thoughts. But one of the things I wondered, Phil, if you could talk about is how to kind of use mindfulness with competitiveness, or this desire to win. And I think, working with Kobe and Michael Jordan, I mean, you've worked with probably two of the most competitive people that I know in the basketball arena and others. How do you balance that energies out? And I know there's a lot of parents out there that see competitiveness in their kids and they want to encourage it, but they also want to manage it. And I'm curious how you navigate that terrain.
Well, there's an instance that I can talk about that I think lends some light to what we're saying. In the 7th game of a series against the Boston Celtics in the last championship that I was part of, I think 2010 was that Celtic-Laker championship run, and we have a 7th game. And Kobe was so geared up in that game that he was trying to do it all by himself. And he, as the game went on, I don't know if he was 3 for 14 at halftime. And I think he ended up being like 6 for 25 or 7 for 25 for the game, shooting wise. And nothing would fall, nothing would go right for him. And he would come back to the bench and he'd be frustrated. And we'd say, just get in the system. All you have to do is just join the rest of the team, find your way into the system and be part of it. And things will start turning out right. We went down by 14 points at some point in the end of the third or beginning of the fourth quarter. And he has accepted it, that it wasn't going to be about his own desire, will, power, and exceptionalism. It was going to be about doing the thing together as a group and being part of the team and getting in the system. And he did that, and it led to the victory, which was close fought.
Wow, that's great. And do you have any reflections now as you look back? Do you think, wow, was I crazy? As you look back at your coaching career, how do you feel? Do you feel proud? Do you feel like, how do you kind of look back at that whole time of your life? I'm curious, now that you've kind of got some space from it, how do you kind of reflect on those coaching years? If that is a logical question to ask.
Oh boy, it's really hard for me because, it's distance. I mean, you're moving into now all the time if you're trying to work through it. But let me tell you that this Last Dance episode that went down on ESPN in June, which was dramatic in its own way, many of the players that were on that team would come back to me and say, how are you doing with all the way it's being displayed, or how Michael's version? And I would say, well, this is Michael's version. It's his mindset. The videos that were taken during that time were mostly of him. Mm-hmm. They were also of us, but this is our journey. We remember it for what it was, the exceptionalism that we had together, the teamwork that we had together. I had a player that called me from Australia, Luke Longley, and said, the people in Australia who saw that I was a starter for 4 years on this team, this Last Dance Dream Team, wonder where I'm at. They don't even see me on this video. And the third string center's the guy talking all the time in this version. So there were people that had to, check their own ego to watch it, even, that were on that team. So my description is just sit back and enjoy it. It's a reflection from Michael's standpoint that tells a lot about who we were and who we are. And a lot of that in that episode didn't disregard our meditative sessions, but kind of jumped over it a little bit. George had one sequence that was in there too that didn't really reflect the level of what we really use mindfulness for and how we attained a certain sense of unity, of one-mindedness. I mean, in the sequences where we would go through a video, I would tell players, I'm looking for players that aren't going to pass the ball to Michael Jordan, that are going to reflect what we're supposed to be doing. And we can always get back to Michael Jordan. He's terrific, and we know about that. But we'll get back to him when it's time. Just play the game as you want the game to be played, in selfishness and just in one-mindedness.
Yes, I was going to say because I actually got interviewed for over an hour to be in that series, and they never got to it. And so I felt like, from my perspective, they were focusing on sensationalism, and I want to give the editors some leeway, because this was forced into production so that they had, he had to do most of the editing at home, and there was a time lag. And so if you look at it, it's interesting, because I was talking to this gentleman that does documentaries, and he said from his vantage point, there wasn't a cohesion. And I knew what was missing was the spiritual stuff that, whether you want to call it that Zen Buddhism stuff or whatever, which Michael alluded to at different times. And also the transformation that not only happened with Michael, but happened with other players, that wasn't expressed in the movie, in what they showed. But once again, that's a version. And in my mind, if I think about it, the guy that shot the scenes, the videos, Andy Thompson should have been the one. He should have been a technician, or he should have been the technical advisor, because he had the background on all of these shots. You got all this video stuff. And there was one session where Michael and I were in the training room when we had this 45-minute dialogue, and we covered a lot of things, nowhere to be found. So they weren't interested in talking about the spiritual aspect of it, or the Zen Buddhism stuff, the stuff that we're talking about. So of course I wasn't going to be in it. I knew from the first advertisement that they weren't going to show that, because you could see the way it was going. So what's missing, or I won't say it's missing, but what they didn't focus on is the underlying stuff, the unseen stuff, the stuff that really talks about the one breath, one mind, and also just the fact that there were other contributors that didn't see the light of day. And so on some level, it's a selection of who they're going to interview, or who's open to being interviewed, because there were a lot of cats that were very, I mean, just everybody. It was like, Phil says the strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. That wasn't expressed in the Last Dance, I don't think, in a way that it could have been. But then again, that is traditional stuff versus what we've done, or what we've been doing, is non-traditional. It's more about just connecting to something higher than yourself, and then going out there and playing the game in a way where five fingers on the hand are in unison and working together. So you don't really point out one finger is more important than the other, although there's some truth to that. But without the other pieces, it's not going to happen.
That thumb is pretty darn important to us, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, don't lose the footage, because maybe The Last Dance is only one of a whole number of films, not just of the Bulls, but of the Lakers, that just like this conversation could probe another level, if you will, of reality that goes beyond the form and the featuring of particular kind of superstars as the real story, to something that's actually much deeper, and in a way actually goes beyond story altogether, so that you manifest something in this space of interconnectedness of minds where you can't actually express it in the usual narrative way, because if you open your mouth, you're actually diluting and polluting the beauty of the connection. So we have an impossible task here that we've sort of offering ourselves, and that is to, in some sense, at least explore these deep questions of what happens when you get people who ordinarily would never sit still for a moment in the kind of way that George has taught them to, and then apply that in action on the field, on the court. Did you see moments that actually revealed something to you that you didn't even imagine was possible when you got into this kind of thing? I'm guessing there were many, many such moments, and that there are real lessons here about how to, sort of wake up the potential in a range of different kinds of personalities and people with different kinds of talents, and maybe some degree of animosity among all of themselves, and find some kind of common willingness to expand their minds and hearts for a purpose that's no longer winning the game so much as showing what's possible under impossible odds.
I think that I have an illustration that might help in that regard, John. And that's, we had a game that year without Michael Jordan. We had a very successful season up until the last regular season game. We were tied for first place in our Eastern Conference. And during the playoffs, we had a situation where we had a player, Scottie Pippen, not go in a ball game and refuse to go in the basketball game.
I remember the incident.
There were a lot of things behind that weren't revealed in that video of The Last Dance.
Yeah.
But in the process of going back to the locker room after, Tony Kukoc had hit a shot to win the ball game. The team was hurt. And when I went down in the locker room, I usually give them a little bit of space, and I take out contacts to do that and wash my face in cold water. And our lavatory was right beside the shower room. And in the shower room, I heard our other co-captain, Bill Cartwright, crying, sobbing actually. And I went in the shower and I said, Bill, are you okay? And he said, yeah, I'm just so hurt that Scotty, broke up what we were doing as a team. And I said, let's go back out and we'll talk about it as a team. And so we went back into the locker room, tiny little locker room. And I said, Scotty, this is something that is against all principles of team play. And, I could express, our disappointment in it, but I think Bill, as a co-captain with you, could probably talk about it better than I can. And Bill just, talked about how the team had tried to overcome the loss of Michael Jordan the whole year. And they had played together so well without an ego, without trying to be selfish in an unselfish manner, that this hurt very deeply. And there's a regulation that you have to be out of the locker room in an X amount of time and meet the press. And my time was up to meet the press. I walked out of the locker room and I felt that the locker room was going to be safe. And I think the team was going to be safe. And we were. We went on and played, to the seventh game in that playoffs. We lost eventually to the Knicks. But it was a team that I think got healed around it. And when I went into the practice site the next day, Michael Jordan called. He was at baseball, and he said, I don't think Scottie Pippen is ever going to live down the moment when he didn't go in a ball game, which is kind of true when it come back to seeing this last dance. It hurt, I think, Scottie Pippen again. And we had to, as team members, had to reach out to him during this program to assure him that his presence was very important to us and that he played as unselfish as any player, and that the circumstances that had created this animosity in him, he let control him. And the issue that was so vibrant in that whole thing was that Scotty was supposed to take the clock down to the last second in the 24-second clock and take a shot. And he was going to, and the whole sequence was going to feed into an isolation. And when he did that, and we went into this situation, Tony Kukoc ran back into that isolated zone and destroyed the ability for Scotty to take on this project of running out the clock and taking a shot. And his shot was an air ball, which let the clock go back to 3 seconds, which then eventually the Knicks inbounded the ball. It went to Ewing. He scored in the second and a half, which still left us whatever, second 2 or whatever that was on the clock. And then I diagrammed a play for Tony Kukoc, the guy who had actually destroyed Scotty's isolation, which I think was a factor in his determination not to sit out, not to participate. Not to sit out that moment. So the story wasn't completely told, but we got to it. And as a team, and I think George was helpful in this, and our meditation was really helpful the next day to reclaim our group dynamic again. And I think that was probably one of the best things that happened in that process.
And so I'd like to just add to another dimension that most people are not aware of. When you think about Scotty's mindset and what was happening, you got to understand that, number one, he was underpaid. He wanted to get paid more. And then you got this white dude from Europe coming in and taking a shot, and he hadn't earned it. So from the context of being an African-American man and feeling, so there's that dimension that we have to understand, that even though people will say, okay, shouldn't have done that, but But I feel like when we see things the way people see things, we would do what they did. And so we don't agree with it, but you have to bring that element in. He's been the second banana to MJ, and then he is his team. And then this cat comes over from Europe, because that's why if you go back to the Last Dance, which was not the Last Dance, but the Dream Team 1992, they went after Kukoc for that very reason. Him and Michael went after him. It just made his first game miserable. And then now this cat comes on the scene because this is the first year he's there, and you're going to run a play for him, and he just messed my play up. So I'm not justifying what I'm saying. He was out of his mind. We know that his mind was gone. So you have to look at it from the context, especially now with Black Lives Matter and all of this other stuff. People don't understand that what he coming from Arkansas, what his background experience has been in life beyond the court, and then not being respected. And we could quibble about whether or not he should be angry, but not feeling totally appreciated by the Bulls and by Jerry Krause. And Jerry Krause is the cat that brought this guy in. There's a whole lot of stuff there that is unusual and not the norm. And of course, we want to train people to be able to hold all of that without, and still be able to stay in the moment without losing our mind. But sometimes you have to lose your mind to find your mind. And I would say that in this case, that's how I look at it. That's my spin. And I think what Phil is not really saying that's really obvious to me is the way that he held Scotty and didn't make him wrong, but just say you have to do this, made it a lot easier for Scotty to deal with his own shame and frustration. Because even though he did that out of anger, he was not proud of that. And now it's still, and you can tell by how it hurt him, that we all make mistakes that we would like to claim back. But, it is what it is. And we have to make peace with it. We have to let go and forgive. And that's where the healing comes from. And so it's obvious that there's probably some more healing he needs to do around that. And so I just want to bring that perspective in, because a lot of times we see things based on what we're seeing, but we don't know the history. Or it's like if I'm having a conversation with Phil and John, you come in and you hear our conversation and you say something, but you're basing everything you say on what's in that conversation, but you don't know what went on before that's creating the context in which that communication is happening. So I'm just using that as an excuse, but that's why a lot of times my job is really to not judge and to really try to understand where the player is, so that I can meet him where he is, or the person, and then be able to help them sort through it and to make peace.
Well, George, that's an absolutely magnificent and very poignant teaching in its own right. The potential to really understand somebody that you're very angry at or alienated from, because all of a sudden the rules that you thought you were all playing by are different. And where somebody takes something personal for the way you've mapped it out, such understandable reasons that you think, well, anybody would do it under the circumstances. There are things more important than making a basket or even a winning basket when it comes to personal integrity and how you've been treated and everything else. So this is one of the things that just hearing you say it that way, I find very moving, because we're actually moving towards kind of some of the deep stuff that unfolds to give the performance, so to speak, or to have it be showtime and everybody comes away in a multi-billion-dollar industry and everything else. But there are real lives playing out on the court, and it's much more than just who gets the more hoop baskets, when the buzzer goes off. But like, who are we? What are these lives? How are we serving each other in that kind of thing? And I think that part of the reason that we love sports so much is that it actually is, in some sense, a metaphor for life itself. And if we're treating life itself as if it's totally mechanical and everybody just has to do what they're supposed to do and nobody has any feelings and nobody takes anything personally with them. Of course, that's not life. And so part of the meditation practice is actually learning in the moments that are the most scary of all, or the most harming of all, to not fall into your narrative to the point where you don't just abandon the other people that you're on the court with and everything that you've agreed to do, but you're also in some sense selling yourself short in a particular way that then you do have the potential to regret later. And part of, as I understand it, your social contract was one of acceptance and forgiveness and transcending that kind of thing and not letting it lose the beauty of what it is that your teams were all about. Would you say that's fair?
I think yes, and in the issue of where we were going with that diagram, with that episode of Scotty and Tony Kukoc, is that Tony was a guy that could catch and shoot the basketball. And Scotty was not a shooter. He was a one-on-one player. And Scotty not recognizing that at this particular time, someone else's talent was greater than his own, was a sense of his own ego-driven nature. But he was able to come away from that, learning something about himself. And we were able to come away from that still having a team that was healed or wasn't destroyed by an individual, a captain that had, basically gone a little bit astray after we had spent so much time trying to emulate this process that we were undergoing. Now, this is the first year of our, meditative practice.
Right.
This is our very first year, the year that Michael wasn't there. So they were still learning and they were still adjusting. And as we got deeper into this element over the years, I think many more guys adjusted on the move, on the fly, in the moment at situations that arose where they were hurt or humiliated or underappreciated, and got over it really much quicker. And I think that's the point that really is made by this exercise that we're doing. And how do you practice this in an active group? How do you practice this without the idea that, I'm going to make more money, or I'm going to be more famous, or I'm going to be about just being here and doing it in the present and being part of this experience, which is really gratifying. There's nothing more gratifying than these things that you do in the moment that feel like, that was special. One of the things that was emphasized in this series is that you're only successful at the moment you perform a successful act. This is what we told our players. You're only a success at the moment you perform a successful act. You can't go back next fall after you won a championship and think that you're going to win another one just because of what we won last year. So we kept putting that point in, and this is what it's all about, is that, I could pat myself on the back, something happened, we had 11 championships, I was a part of that. What does that help me do in this present life where I have, 19 people living here in my little compound in Montana? 9 of them are children that have to be dealt with from moment to moment. They want lunch. It's 1:30.
Hey, well, how beautiful that you make that kind of a link, because what we're really talking about is life itself, and I'm sure that I'm guessing, but I'm fairly sure that Scotty learned an enormous amount from that, and that the team also learned an enormous amount from that. And I don't know if you emphasize this, George, in your work, but I certainly do in mine, is that asking people to meditate and to drop in on the timeless dimension of the present moment and stay in open, spacious awareness without getting lost in thought, especially when it's driven by self-centered emotion, is just about the hardest work in the world for any human being. And it's much harder than any of your shoot-arounds or trainings for the NBA. That's really very, very difficult for human beings to actually not take personally what's not personal and stay in this open-hearted spaciousness. And the fact that you have been able to do this with multiple teams is really remarkable, because it's a vector, an arrow pointing towards something where the spectators would benefit as much from this kind of practice as the people on the floor. And there's an inspiration too, an inspiration factor in that, well, you know, if Michael Jordan or Scottie Pippen actually practice fine-tuning their own minds, even to whatever degree they do, that is incredibly inspiring for kids who want to, you know, emulate Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, you know, sort of, or anybody else.
Yeah.
And so basketball can actually, in some sense, transform society or any sport. And I think that's one of the roles of sport in society, especially spectator sports, is that it inspires people to transcend the limited narratives of themselves that are sometimes defined by other people or circumstances. And then when people feel that, sometimes you don't even need to say anything. It's the dignity of the person. Jackie Robinson. I mean, anybody who, like, you know, stands in their own being and their own truth, even when they're hurting, and knows how to be in wise relationship to it. I don't know of very many things that are more inspiring to other people, including spectators. But at the same time, they're uplifting in the sense that this is not something special. This is something we could all
Right.
do to some degree or other and benefit from. And in order to do that, you have to understand that mindfulness is not a dime store technique that, you know, a little breathing in, a little breathing out, a little paying attention, but that it actually is the hardest work in the world to let go of trying to get anywhere else and be 100% where you already are and not be caught in any narrative, and
Yeah.
therefore open to possibility.
So I just wanted to thank you for saying that, John, because going back to what Phil said about you're only as successful as the present moment. So working with Phil with the Bulls 93 to 98, and then the Lakers from, I guess it was 99 to 2003, whatever it was. But there was a 7-year period from 96 to 2002. And that 7-year period of, I was with Phil and we won 6 NBA championships in a 7-year period with 2 different teams. And I did not become aware of that till years later when I was writing out my, you know, my CV and, you know, what my work experiences. And I said, holy crap, because just like he said, we win a championship, we celebrate a little bit, then we get back to work. And the year he took off is the year we didn't win anything. But that is the intensity of it, that it becomes a way of life that I didn't recognize it. And even now, I'm pretty sure Phil has the same experience, that you're just in the moment and going to the next thing, that we don't have time to rest on our laurels. You're actually, it becomes a way of life. And so for me to go through, I'm saying, how could I have 6 championships, be part of 6 championships in 7 years and not know about it or not even let it in, because of what Phil said, because it was like, okay, the next season, we got to get ready for the next thing. And so so you're absolutely right, what Phil was saying and what you were saying, it's something, but I want to say that a lot of times people think it's just the sitting and that's the practice. Well, the way I teach it, the way that we teach it, I believe, is we talk about, you know, right view and right thinking, but also thinking through, reflecting on things. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean. So they become free thinkers and they put skin in the game. So when we're talking about playing the Indiana Pacers in the championship, I think that was that the year we won 72 games, 96? I think it was. Was that the year when Ron said, if we don't win the ring, you know, the game, it doesn't mean a thing, or something like that? I think it was 96.
I think you don't win the ring.
Yeah, so they had the Breakfast Club. So what's the Breakfast Club? So you had Scotty, Michael, and Ron Hopper. They would have their meeting before, and in the Breakfast Club, they came up with the idea that Scottie Pippen should guard Mark Jackson. So they went to Phil and they said, "Hey, Phil, this is what we want to do." Phil said, "Okay." Mark Jackson had 6 turnovers in the first quarter. So they are learning. There's another part of it where you actually start to think about the game and think about how you're going to approach an opponent and how to play to your strengths, but at the same time, how to take away what the opponent does well, which is something that I think I'm right, that Phil, when he would go against a team, he would take something away, what they do. You're just taking it away. Like I remember Muggsy Bogues, he really exposed him. So this is something we do so that the players, because of the mindfulness and the using the mind, being in the moment, and seeking wisdom, seeking understanding, that there's this ability that now they put skin in the game and they are, they're bought in and they're thinking about it before the game comes. And that's when you get into that process where you start to really reflect and understand, okay, even though I'm in the moment, how can I best express myself, or how do I look at things in a way where I have an understanding on how we're going to play, how we're going to be.
Yeah, and would you call that embodiment or inaction? In other words, that's making it real in a certain way.
Yes, that's taking that
Because
that
it's
is
like
being
taking it off the cushion and
yes,
into every
yes,
aspect
yes.
of it.
It's understanding that the present moment, but also just having clarity, not being driven by desire or fear. And so on the one level, it's just about being in the moment and just flowing, but also understanding who you are and how you need to play. And so that's something that, and because and I could see how that developed over the years, because I'm not giving up any trade secrets, but there'd be times when Coach Winters would be telling Phil to call a timeout, and Phil said, "No, I'm not calling a timeout. I'm not bailing them out. They got to figure out how to do it on the fly." And so that didn't come out of nowhere. There was a whole process, and Phil, just the psychology philosophy and the understanding of group dynamics and that sort of thing. That was what was reflected in that. So there's teachings where it's not just sitting in silence, but just being deliberate, being on purpose, having clarity about who we are and how we're going to execute.
That's really interesting, Phil, that as the coach and the person in that kind of let's say nurturing, guiding sort of perspective, that you will let them learn the lessons themselves in the same way as you encourage people to let the game come to you. That there's a certain way in which the no teacher or coach can like implant into another person's head how they should be responding. But as I hear you saying it, George, about when you feel like you've got skin in the game, and to me, what that means is that, if I'm hearing it right, is that now you're letting the game and what's unfolding teach you how you need to be in wise relationship to it, bringing your talent, your particular talents to the game, and everybody who's on the court will be bringing their own particular talents or shortcomings, for that matter, and that's how things grow, and you stretch the envelope, so to speak. Let them hang out and don't rescue them too often with a timeout, for instance. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's appropriate. Yeah, there's numbers of examples like that happen in sports that, as you enumerated, are life lessons. And that's why this organization I was in, Positive Coaching Alliance, we tried to talk about this as a learning opportunities for children, that sports teach children certain opportunities in life, how to deal with failure, how to deal with losing, how to deal with direction, how to live life by rules, by the idea that there are certain rules to the game that we have to appropriately watch, and how to teach parents that you have to encourage action that's correct action, not berating the officials, not yelling at the other team's kids, not trying to destroy performance, but to enhance performance. And then when your child loses, that's okay. We're not always going to be successful, and losing is something we do a lot, but we rebound from it and we move on quickly because we're not going to dwell over there in that part of it for the rest of our days or for this sport. You know, I've got a grandson who is really a good practice player, but he got up to bat and he couldn't stand the pressure. The pressure of all the fans yelling, "Go Eli." He dropped the bat and refused to play because it was too much pressure. I was like, okay, what does that feel like for a kid to feel like he's under that amount of pressure at 7 years of age? It's like, so sports is something like, okay, I've overcome this. It's not so bad to be under this. But then, of course, then it's the other aspect of it. As parents, we need to encourage activity. And we need to encourage, we can't give awards to everybody, even though awards for the winners are great, but not everybody gets the award. It's the fact that we deal more than likely with failure in sports. Great batters only make, what, 300?
Yeah, most of it's like, 66.666% failure at the best. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's another really important point because so many parents vicariously live through their kids' performance and drive it and cause just enormous amounts of damage. Of course, there's the kind of 1% of kids that are just going to be superstars no matter what. But for everybody else, how you actually carry yourself through success and failure, and how you relate to other people who you want to maybe blame for things that arise. These are kind of profound life lessons that are extremely helpful in families, for instance, every single day and every single moment. And I think it is very inspiring, for sure, to know that that people at the level of your teams have been training in that for so long. That was in some sense a signature aspect of your multiple successes, is the nature of the mind, the nature of the heart, the nature of the body, and the nature of we rather than just me.
Yeah.
And I'm agreeing with Soren in the sense that that you have a kind of reservoir of lessons and wisdom for the world that probably hasn't yet been completely articulated. And if it can be articulated in a way that's the way you're articulating it now, would be tremendously inspiring to a very wide range of different kinds of people, especially in what we're facing in the world and in the United States: global warming, pandemic, there's sort of everything going on in terms of, injustice and racial bias, and harm in our faces every single day. These are the lessons that we need to learn as a society, I would say.
Yeah, it comes down to ourselves, though. It comes down to here. It comes down to our ability to control who we are and to improve ourselves, and to hear that voice that says, "Be quiet and still and know." That's the real lesson that goes. And then once we get to that point as individuals, then we can start expanding our community into a larger group and larger sense. And this Zoom opportunity is, wonderful opportunity, but, it still comes back to, are you willing to take the time and invest in yourself and love yourself in this process? And then you can love others.
Beautifully said. And I would just add, George can probably say this more eloquently than I, that there's nothing but time, that taking the time, when you begin to realize that we only have this moment in which to live our lives, then the real meditation practice, as you're saying, George, isn't sitting on a meditation cushion for some period of time. It's how you live in relationship to every single moment of your waking life, at least.
Mhm.
And that could be seen, and I like to talk this way, maybe it's too far out for our conversation, but I didn't get that feeling from watching the Bulls play or the Lakers play, that ultimately is a certain kind of love affair with what's possible under certain kind of circumstances, using certain kind of rules. And that's not that different from democracy itself and the social ills that are in our face at the moment, that are so challenging.
Yes, I would say I've been doing this program called on YouTube, and some of you get the post, being at home with George. And I talk so much about getting beyond the illusion of separateness and being able to hold the hurt and the hope, and understanding that, as Phil said, everything begins with the self. And so I always preach about know yourself so you can be yourself, so you can express yourself, so you can share yourself. But just like Martin Buber says in a book called The Way of Man, he says to begin with yourself, but not to end with yourself. And so that's what it's about. It comes down to cultivating the self, as Phil was talking about. And then from there, all things are possible. And so when I think about the self, when I think about competition, because I get this question all the time, is mindfulness what you do antithetical to competition? I said, no, because you're not competing against anybody out there. You're competing against your previous best self. And so when we can keep it on that level, then we have a shot at it. And like, be still and know, as Phil was saying, but it all starts with the self. And once we're willing, for me, going back 36 years, I feel like I had to forget myself to find myself.
Yeah, Dogen had something to say about that too.
Huh?
Dogen,
Yes, of course he
the
did. Yes,
11th century
yes,
Japanese Zen master, had
yes,
something to say about
yeah,
that.
What did he, John,
yes.
do you want to say what he had to say about that?
I can't give you the direct quote, but it's,
Yeah.
basically to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. And then, of course, Socrates. I mean, we don't need to go to the Zen tradition. I mean,
That's right.
Socrates is most famous probably for saying, know thyself.
Yes,
And then
yes.
one of his wise ass students said to him, as students always do, yeah, well, you go around saying, know thyself, but do you know yourself? And he said, no, because it's always good to confuse the students. But he wasn't finished. He said, no, I wasn't there. So this is totally apocryphal, probably never happened. But the story is that he said, no, but I know something about this not knowing. And so there's this mystery of this word that we call self, or the personal pronouns, I, me, and mine, my story, my failure, my success, my humiliation, my shame. But we never investigate who's talking. We say my body, but we don't know whose body it is. My mind, but it's hard to point to the mind, and it's different in every moment. So there's a certain way in which the practices that you've brought together and instantiated as you have in this domain of, sort of NBA sports, is linking what goes on the court with something that goes on in the mind of every single person when we try to figure out who the hell we are before we die.
Mm.
And that dying now in a certain way, as people recommend, to like the story of me or the ego thought or that fabricated self, actually is an invitation to wake up to some much more nuanced and multiply dimensioned domain of possibilities that, like, is jaw-dropping what you guys have done. I mean, it's simply jaw-dropping. The probability of winning that many championships with, under those circumstances, with those people, that many, those teams, is like, is impossible in a certain way. And it also happened. So this, I'm sure the story, there's no one story. There's no way to actually tell what really happened, but what you guys are carrying is a kind of real repository of wealth and insight into how to stretch the capacities of human beings to work together for a particular objective that's agreed upon. Where as long as you're caught your own ego around it, you could be the best basketball player in the world, but you're not going to actually achieve that level of success.
Would you say that, Phil? Would you say you weren't there to win championships? You were there to help wake up to our deepest nature, and by doing so, you just happened to win more championships? Or how would you frame that orientation? Or
what I tried to emphasize is the real wonder is the journey. This journey we're on is the real wonder. And we hope that at the end of this journey, that there's a culmination that can be experienced, right? But it's still a journey of, you know, whatever it was, 25 to 35 people that were on this journey that was connected to fans and connected to a bigger world, obviously. But it's, you know, that's kind of what it's all about, is that we're on this journey together. And how do we make this happen? And in our society right now, we're not on a journey together. In the American democracy, we're not enjoying this journey together. There was ability for us to try and disrupt. And we've been in a disruptive attitude for the last 4 years. And I don't know whose fault it is, and I'm not concerned. I hold the Democrats as responsible for it as I do the Republicans. The Republicans embodied in the presidential election of Donald Trump. But this is from a wellstream of resistance in our community. And the reason for that is unknown. We don't know whether it's, you know, a resistance against capitalism, Wall Street. What is this all about? Why are we going through this resistance? But we're not on a journey together, and we have to figure out if we want to do that or not. And if we're going to do that, how are we going to collaborate together to do that? We have done so many things in America that are so wonderful, as a giving nation, as a contributing nation to the world, as a, you know, all the things that can be very positive. But somehow or other, this negativity has crept into our society over the course of the last maybe 20 years, since 2000. And whether it's, maybe you can go back to the world, 9/11, towers coming down, have destroyed an image that we had built up. But we have to stop and think about the present. Right now, what's happening in the present moment? Are we enjoying this experience with our families, with our intimate group? I am. I'm enjoying this. I'm not reading what's coming through Google or every day's COVID-19. That's not my problem. That's our society's problem. My problem is about living my life, having these other 19 people on this property that I have here that are all connected to me, and sending out the best vibrations I can as a human being, this being one of them. I've received maybe 10,000 pieces of mail over the last 4 months, 3 months. I'm trying to deal with it because there's so many people that are reaching out, but I can't do it individually. I've got my grandchildren opening letters, signing cards, setting them up for me, just to reach back to these people and give them something else. But it's not just that. It's not about The Last Dance. It's not about basketball. It's about how do we come back and become a community again. Sports brings a lot of that to us. Unfortunately, that's been limited. What's going to be the next thing? Jon, I applaud you for doing this. This is a real positive thing. Many people have told me about it and have spoken very kindly about it. And George, too. Very helpful thing. And I believe in prayer, and I'll pray that it continues, this message continues. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Phil. It's huge honor to have you, and just to have you a part of this conversation in a more direct way is very inspiring for me, and I'm guessing many other people.
It's so nice for me to reconnect with you, quote unquote, in person, which is now always on Zoom over all these years. But just a deep bow to you for who you are and everything you've given us in this world.
Yeah. I want to thank all of you, especially Jon and Phil, for giving me the opportunity to express myself and to make contributions. And I feel like I'm just getting started.
Wonderful. Well, Phil, I know how many grandkids do you have there? 17 total people, or 17 grandkids?
9 grandkids.
9 grandkids. Wow.
People, yeah.
Wow. Well, Jon, what do you have? 3 at your place?
2 here and 2 in California, but 2 under our roof, and it's fabulous because they're 6 and 2, 7 and 2, and so it's 24/7, 7 days a week, and it couldn't be more wonderful.
Yeah. Well,
Also very challenging.
Back to them. We'll let you get back to them, and again,
Yeah.
deep thank you. And
but also, I want to say something to you, George, because we've been friends for so long, and I just really want to bow to you for who you are, who you've always been, for your integrity and for your modesty, and for the ways that you can connect that really elevate people's lives and possibilities. And I know you're doing it in a lot of different ways, and I know now you're doing it on Zoom in ways that when I follow it, it's like, yes, wonderful. I mean, so glad you're out there in that kind of a way. But again, building on The Last Dance, The Last Dance, that program, but we're all part of The Last Dance, and it's still going. It's still unfolding. And I am really sanguine about the potential for the beauty, the joy, and the love and the lessons that we've learned to actually, in ways known and unknown, subtle and not so subtle, get out there to heal the world in just the ways that you spoke about, Phil. And, it really is one of those critical moments on the planet where, as I like to say, quoting Buckminster Fuller, we need all hands on deck on planet Earth, and to show up in our fullness as opposed to in some kind of contracted, self-centered, deluded way. And that's the practice, right? It's liberating in that sense. It's really freedom embodied and enacted for all of us.
I had an image, Phil, when you were talking about kind of your thoughts on the nation and the Republicans and Democrats, of like Democrats and Republicans were all together in this huddle, and you're there as our coach. You're like, okay, this is what we need to win here. Right. I just had that image. I don't know if that'll ever quite come to manifest in the way I visualized it, but it's a really sweet kind of visualization of like, where's our coach? Like we're off center, and there's no coach that I see that's coming in to like help us redirect. And I pray with you that will emerge, or we'll figure it out ourselves.
Yeah.
Thanks, Soren.
I wanted to thank you also, Soren, for allowing us to have this platform.
Of course.
kind of do this. And Phil, when you talked about prayer, there's Edgar Casey said that he said, don't worry as long as you can pray, but if you can no longer pray, then you should worry. So prayer is very good.
Yeah, and this was George. This would not have happened, George, without you. So thank you for you were the instrument that bound us all together. So.
Well, I'm happy that we're able to do this because there's definitely a story to be told and to be shared, and I have no doubt that this is going to help the process that Phil, you talked about us needing to get to, and if we can get more people who can wake up and understand that it's better together, and that we have to figure out who we want to be and where we're going. As they say, if you don't know where you're going, you could end up going anywhere. So, and if you don't know who you are, you can end up being anybody. And I think we have to get to that place of that, as we call it, the moment of truth. Now is the time. Step up, or as Vin Diesel says, step up or step aside. It's either or, but we need everybody to step up. We can't afford people to step aside. That's part of the problem, I think. So
thank you again for this. And if we need to do more, or you have ideas, or there's something that would be useful, we can come back together again if we need to. But
all right, thanks. I appreciate you. Okay, thanks, Phil. Appreciate you, Soren, John, and there's another John in the background.
Basher.
JB, appreciate you, buddy.
The whole field. Thanks, John and Soren.
All right. Bye now. See you.
Goodbye.